Good afternoon. I'd like to invite everyone to take their seats. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nancy Farrell. I'm from Reginaville Associates, and we staff the public outreach on the project, and I've been asked to moderate today's discussion. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate a strong attendance. What we're going to do today is have a short presentation that Ethan's going to make addressing some of the issues that people are interested in. And then there is a group, I think largely Western Mass, which is going to do a short presentation. It's not something that the team saw before a few minutes ago, so we may not be prepared totally to have a full response, but we're really interested in the questions. And after that presentation, we will what our goal is to go around the table and to hear from all of you what your priorities are, what the key issues are for you, and start to begin approaching this short list that we've been talking about. No further questions and no further ado, I'll introduce Ethan to do the first presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. So again, my name's Ethan Britland. I am with Mass DOT, project manager for the East-West Passenger Rail Study. And I just, as always, wanted to go around the room very briefly and just have everybody do introductions. If we want to start on the left side.
Sure, John.
And we have FRA on the conference call line. Okay. So I also wanted to just open the floor up to Kim Robinson from Pioneer Valley real quick.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Kim, by the way.
Okay, should I start over?
Please.
Okay, thank you. So we have some sad news to share. Timothy Brennan, who was my predecessor, and I know so many of you worked with for such a long time, is not doing well. He is quite ill, and obviously he was a major proponent of East-West Rail, and I'm sure would want to be here in this conversation today. We are asking for folks, his family is asking for folks to send their thoughts if they'd like. We have an email address for that, and I've been assured with Ethan that we can get that email address to folks, but we wanted to share that with folks. It's an opportunity to reach out and share with Tim one last time. So thank you, Ethan.
Thank you. So as Nancy said, we have a very short presentation today. The primary purpose of today's meeting is to hear from the advisory committee and facilitate a discussion. These are our meeting objectives. We just want to quickly talk about some of the additional work that we're going to be doing, both for the shortlist, but also, as we heard loud and clear from the advisory committee meeting and the public meeting on the 12th, that we need to look at ridership and forecasting and sensitivity more closely. And then there's the facilitated discussion that Nancy's going to lead. Talk about pros and cons of the preliminary alternatives, hybrids, sequencing or phasing, and then priorities for shortlisting. Next steps, want to say this from the beginning, we are coming back to the advisory committee before we nail down any type of short list of alternatives. There's a lot up in the air right now, a lot is on the table. We're here for a facilitated discussion, and so next steps are going to be guided by what comes out of today's meeting. So this is, I guess it's called a word cloud. Thank you, Michaela, on the project team. This is what we have heard, there's obviously we heard a lot, but these are a lot of the primary points we heard both from the advisory committee and from the public meeting. And I think this really isn't a surprise to anybody in terms of what's up here. We understand, we heard loud and clear, and so we're all here to work together towards a common goal. Oops, that was fast. Okay, sorry. That's a fast clicker. So we have our, what we're going to be looking at, and again, these are ideas and things that we're looking to do as part of ridership sensitivity, but we're obviously looking for, as part of the facilitated discussion, sensitivity elements. So we are looking at incorporating induced demand directly into the stations. We understand that the demographic data used did not include any kind of land use or transformative elements related to what would happen if a rail line were to go in with more and higher frequent service. So we're looking at layering induced demand, expanding demographic coverage. We had a 20-mile buffer. We're looking at a 40-mile buffer. Also, we want to make sure that higher education institutions are incorporated, and we've been looking into the demographic data more closely. And we also looking at other modeling, model lines, I would say. Again, NERI included the Hartford line, which is why we pivoted off of that for our modeling, but we're also looking at Downeaster, which may offer different ridership characteristics. And then looking at additional benchmarking and calibration. So that's the sensitivity. That is, we heard from everyone that the ridership needs to be looked at more closely. This slide here, this is to highlight what we're going to do once we get to a short list of alternatives. And the reason we're showing this is because a lot of the comments we heard, both at advisory committee and at the public meeting, were things that we were going to do anyway, but they weren't. It might have come across that they were things that were left out, but it was in actuality they were going to be done for the short list of 3 alternatives. So we just wanted to highlight that we're going to be going over some of the other transportation-related benefits, operations, time and reliability, environmental factors, and benefit cost. We're also going to be looking at other types of impacts, if you want to call them that, also benefits, output, value added, labor force, growth, things of that sort. So again, this is going to be done for the shortlist alternatives, which we have not nailed down yet. And this is where I turn it over to Nancy. But these are our key questions for shortlisting. These are meant to start the discussion. These are questions we want to hear people answer. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. Thank you.
So actually, what we're going to do is ask Maureen and Jonathan to do their presentation now before we start our discussion, because we understand that some of their comments in the presentation, which was outside, in case you didn't get a copy yet, some of their comments may inform the discussion that the rest of us are going to have. So I welcome you to the microphone. I think easier for folks to hear and for the media.
Hi, everybody. My name's Maureen Mullaney. I'm with the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and with me is Jonathan Butler from One Berkshire. First off, I'd just like to really thank MassDOT for doing this study and for including us as planning partners in it. As you've all heard over the past months and time frame, Western Mass feels very passionately about this project and believes that it can have a transformative impact on the Commonwealth as a whole, not just Western Mass. So what we did was get together a group of us from Western Mass, the regional planning agencies, Franklin, Berkshire, Pioneer Valley, and the Capital Region in Hartford, along with One Berkshire and Senator Hines, to review the information that the project team gave to us over the last month and really just kind of dive in and try to digest what was going on in there so that we could give the most informed feedback that we could to help make the study even better, to make the study a success, because I know that's what we all want. So in terms of getting that information pulled together, it just kind of coalesced into writing it down and turning into a presentation. We didn't really intend for it to become a whole thing. We just wanted to make sure that our comments were captured and thought that it would be easiest for the project team to be able to reference back to them if we had it written down. So we have about 17 slides, which we're not going to spend a ton of time on all of them. We just want to touch on the main points that we think are important to be considered. We did have a few concerns with the study. First, as I said, it should be a statewide project, not just a Western Mass project, because the benefits of this project are felt statewide. We thought there were a few areas that needed to be explored more. The travel demand we didn't think had been fully explored. And there are other statewide goals that we know are important to this study that we hope will be included in future phases of what we're doing, particularly things related to housing and emission reductions and things like that. Also, we felt the ridership numbers were low, as has been acknowledged. I was glad to hear Ethan talking about the sensitivity of some of that information and looking to reanalyze and refine some of that information. The areas that we wanted to address are the ridership projections, which, as I said, MassDOT acknowledged they will be looking further to refine. The station proxies, components to add alternative analysis, including emission and VMT reductions, revenue projections. We didn't see those in there, and hope that as the future phases of this project go along, more discussion about other statewide and federal policy goals and how this project really feeds into that. The cost assumptions are in preliminary stages, I think, and will be refined. And our main mission is to get to the alternatives, to shortlist the alternatives. I was glad to hear Ethan say that the 20-mile radius is being expanded to 40, because 20 really doesn't capture it in Western Mass. Those of you who live in Western Mass know that you'll drive 30 minutes to the grocery store. So 20 miles isn't really insurmountable for somebody to catch a train to go into the city. And just demonstrating that, we had this map in there. This was a 45-minute drive time rather than a mile radius. The fuchsia color is the 20-mile. The purple is 45-minute drive time. And we think that that more accurately represents what people might be willing to do in order to access the train. Jonathan's going to talk about some of the ridership projections. And again, this was just, we did some analysis of census data so that we could have kind of a better understanding of who really might be commuting and see if those numbers were, what they looked like.
Hello. I'll just echo Maureen's comments and just say, thank you to the project team for the work that's already been done. We appreciate it. When we put together a group that came together last Friday, we had a whole number of different stakeholders from the committee represented, some that signed their name on to just like the data itself, the work that we put together. But I think we definitely had consensus in the room that the questions that we're posing were ones worth considering. All of our organizations are really kind of deeply invested in data. We work with data on a daily basis. So what we're really trying to do with this is just broaden the way that we're approaching some of these things that I think the initial metrics might have caught us by surprise with, such as ridership. So the ridership slide in front of you now, the original project team statistics provided for ridership were surprising to a lot of us. We did think they were low, but we understand there's more work to be done, so we appreciate already the earlier comments that we're going to continue to look into ridership. But we thought we would just take one vantage point of ridership and look at it a little bit differently. And the original projections range from around 11,000 up to 117,000 in options 1 through 5. And I think proposal 6, the high-speed rail, was a little higher at about 250,000. And the breakdown of that was, that number was put together by 10% with regular commuters, 26% with business travelers, and then 64% with personal travel. So we actually just looked at that regular commuters number. And the data that we used was the U.S. Census Employer Household Reporting. So this chart, this data up in front of you is basically the people that live in the 4 western counties as well as Hartford County that commute to Eastern Mass destinations for work currently. And we understand in that number of 17,000, some of them are, probably even a majority of them are telecommuting. So we'll speak to that. The next slide is kind of the flip side of that. It's other travel that's captured through that same census. So this is actually people from Eastern Mass coming to Western Mass job sites, or even travel within Western Mass that wasn't captured in the original data. And that gives us a total of almost 3,500 people. And when we add those together, and I'm just taking a second on this because we thought this was pretty compelling. It got us actually very excited about ridership. But when you add those together, it's 21,231 individuals that are basically potential candidates to commute using this project, this rail as a means of getting to work. So to adjust for telecommuting and other things, we're taking 10% of that 21,000, which gives us 2,131. And when you multiply that by work days only, we arrive at a number of 554,000 people, which obviously is a lot higher than the 117 number, and we appreciate that it's probably somewhere in the middle, or or leaning one direction or the other. But we thought that this number was compelling, and this number also is only really looking into that commuter travel, and it only represents weekday traffic. So this isn't getting into people that will travel for entertainment, for visiting, for vacations, or even like casual business travelers that might only travel once or twice a month for business, or any weekend travel. On the issue of induced ridership, we had a couple of thoughts on that. This slide really actually just kind of lays out the definition of induced ridership. Obviously, induced ridership wasn't a big factor in the initial project team's estimates. That's going to be part of what we have moving forward. But we had some thoughts about the types of consideration that we thought were important as we look at induced ridership. One of them is gas prices. We did some research on this, and this slide is actually pretty helpful. But obviously in the Commonwealth, we're heading towards a place where gas prices are likely to face some impacts, whether it's keeping up with TCI or other legislative and policy changes in the next 10 years and the coming decades, but also potential changes in just the gas tax. Beyond that, we know that induced ridership numbers are calculated for rail providers such as Amtrak. It's one of the ways they actually estimate their ridership using gas prices. And an example of our own experiences in Western Mass with that are the Franklin Regional Transit Authority during the Great Recession in 2008 or 2007 to 2009 actually saw almost a 20% increase in their ridership when gas prices were spiked up.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. The takeaway is that we know that there's a housing crisis in Eastern Mass. We know that there's housing available in Western Mass. Making travel back and forth between the two regions easier makes it possible for those who might want to relocate further out of the city to cheaper housing stock possible. We think that's a huge potential for this rail. And we know that is housing is a very top priority for the Baker administration. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this other than we just wanted to point out that there was a study about providing passenger rail between Boston and Springfield and other points called the NERI study. And the ridership numbers and things like that between the two studies are quite different. So we weren't really understanding what the methodology was and asking for more information about how that was determined and how they can be so different. And this is just, again, we wanted to point out that the ridership assumptions need to be refined, as I think has already been acknowledged by MassDOT and the project team. We think that there are opportunities to really look at additional riders in a different way, and that that should be done. We thought that the station pairs that were used for comparison maybe should be considered to be changed. The Boston metropolitan area is a whole different animal than Hartford or Wallingford, which was one of the proxy pairs being used. We think that looking at the Downeaster makes sense. We also think looking at the Providence to Boston market makes sense. If you look at the populations and the distances, those other options might provide some insight into how this line might function. And we also think that the study, and I'm sure that this is probably coming in the next phase, but what we were reacting to was what we'd seen so far. The revenue projections should be included. We noted that it didn't seem that there were any VMT or emission reductions calculated as part of this. Some of the more negative environmental impacts had been accounted for, but the positive environmental impacts hadn't been yet called out, and we think that's important. And also just wanted to point out again that there are a number of statewide and federal policies looking to accomplish a number of things, particularly related to the transportation sector in terms of reducing emissions, the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Transportation Climate Initiative, Transit-Oriented Development. All of these things are addressed beautifully with an east-west rail line. And then we just have a couple last slides. We're just gonna wrap up talking about some cost assumptions and the alternatives.
There's the priority shortlist slide. I was gonna go to that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just two more summary slides just to kind of point to a couple of the things that were already mentioned. So, again, this is a statewide project, and we just hope that as we continue this study that we're looking at it that way, not just a Western Mass project. We thought that was very eloquently stated by the Boston Globe in their editorial on Friday. And I'd just like to share the anecdote of one of our social media followers at One Berkshire, following up to some of the posts that we've had throughout the last few weeks, saying that he's an Eastern Mass commuter, saying that this project would act like a pressure release valve for the East. Another piece is that all parts of the state should be treated equitably in terms of how we're ascertaining demand. So we think looking into things like potential Eastern Mass forums to gauge interest in an East-West project, and also potentially a statewide demand survey where we can actually get some real qualitative feedback. Obviously, I'll just restate, as has been stated in other meetings, Representative Pignatelli has stated emphatically, no bus service to Pittsfield. This is a rail project. Just summarizing, the project also contributes to multiple other Massachusetts policy goals, from emissions and greenhouse gases to relieving traffic condition in and around Boston, potentially helping with the housing crisis, and then also potentially helping with our population loss that we have in the Berkshires and Hampden County. And then just this project also potentially supports priorities of other secretariats, and we'd like to see that in some ways incorporated into future work. And then just the last couple of points. We feel that it's difficult at this point for the organizations that were involved in our conversations to really point to shortlisting options. So it's good to hear that we're kind of extending that time frame to think about that. Obviously, continuing to look at things like no bus service and narrowing it down at least through that vantage point. But we also thought alternative 5 was one that definitely merited some deeper consideration. When we talk about how we can potentially carve these together differently, alternative 5 seemed to be very advantageous for the Boston to Springfield route. And if it then continued to Pittsfield with a rail option, that could be a really interesting opportunity. And then just a couple of other summary points of everything that Maureen and I shared is looking at this idea of station radii and travel times, reevaluating our ridership numbers, finding comparable station pairs when looking at what types of projects will help us with projection of ridership, and then just continuing to look at things like emissions reduction. And the last, I think, piece of consensus that we had with the group that met, and again, it represented a pretty significant portion of stakeholders on this committee, was that we feel like this work is generational in nature, it's critical, and that we have to get it right. The study needs to really speak to what the real costs are, the real benefits are, and what the statewide benefits are. So we feel that if extending the time frame to get it right is something that needs to be considered, we were all comfortable with that. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen and Jonathan. As an outreach coordinator, it's very exciting when the advocates come with a presentation. I can't tell you, this has hardly ever happened in my professional career, so thank you very much. And the first thing that Astrid has asked me to do is to invite the folks who are involved in putting together this presentation to sit down with the team and have a discussion of all the issues that are that you have presented, some of which Ethan has addressed briefly, but that which you could sit down and, so before you leave today, let's make sure we pick out a date and we can go forward from there. So I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas. You stole my thunder. You've got the what matters to you on your next to last slide, which is my goal in going around the room today and asking everyone else what matters to them. Yes. Sarah has put up does this thing move? No. Oh, no, okay. So we have a microphone which we're going to pass around, and our goal is to try to ask you to answer these questions. And I know it may be hard for some folks to give us a precise answer about the alternatives, even with the understanding that we're not going to make you sign on the dotted line today about what your preferences are. I think what we want to do is try to get a sense of what your service priorities are, what criteria you would use to narrow down from the 6 to 3, what trade-offs are acceptable and not acceptable, and if there are hybrids of the preliminary alternatives that you find appealing. Now, you're not transportation planners, but you're all people who have ideas and experiences which we think are extremely valuable, which is why you're at the table today, and that you know what the folks you're representing care about in your community. So really want to try to pull out from you some of your instincts as the first group did about what's important to them as we go forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I went back and looked at the notes and the presentations from the first few meetings, and the things that folks said were their goals, it seemed to me have been pretty consistent through time. Connections, mobility, economic development, opening the job market and the housing market in relative parts of the state, and reliability, housing, making travel faster. And one interesting comment was a realistic program that will provide service within 10 years. And so those are the kinds of issues that were brought up initially, and having been through a few meetings, you probably have some additional ideas about what you'd like to see. I wanted to share a little bit, an anecdote about South Coast Rail Project, which I've been working on since 2007. There are people on the project who've been at it much longer than I have. And it seemed a couple years ago that it wasn't going to happen because the cost was too expensive, $3 billion. And at the end of this month, this month, the first phase of the project has now gone out to bid. And while the first phase will be slightly shorter than the full build design is still underway. And everyone who's been waiting for South Coast Rail for about its service stopped in 1957. The effort to get it moving again was about 30 years ago. So in 4 years, people from New Bedford, Fall River, Taunton, Middleborough will be able to take trains to Boston. And it's a very exciting prospect. So it's something that I share with you as a model or a possibility, or you may not be interested in it at all, but it's the kind of thing we'd like to hear from you as we go around the table, what your thoughts are, and what you think about the alternatives. So, everybody okay with that? All right. So John, you get to start, because we're going to start over there. Got to put some... Exactly.
So thank you very much. I was talking with the congressman about this before coming over, and I think that Liz from Congressman Neal's office would share this, is that they were both really encouraged in their first conversation and when they got a briefing from Astrid and folks. They're not scared off by price tags. I think they very much want to make sure the federal government is a clear partner in this. There's a hope that there will be some sort of infrastructure package coming along in the not too distant future, hopefully. And just like there was with the stimulus bill back 10, 12 years ago, significant dollars came to the state. So it's a number one priority for Congressman McGovern and probably also for Congressman Neal. So we're not scared off by large numbers, but at the same time, we want to see cost transparency and know that those are accurate because they want to get behind whatever that project is as quickly as possible. And lastly, I just say, equity is a big part of this. We here in the western and central part of the state feel like we give more than our fair share to the east. And while this is a statewide project, we need to see some return on our investment to our friends and neighbors to the east. And we think at the same time it's going to benefit them as well, as folks have laid out. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Hello again, Darren Gray, Bay State Health. Well, first of all, thanks. I'm happy to be a part of this, and Bay State Health was invited to join. Our company mission, improve the health of our community every day with quality and compassion. And as we talk about this project, the impacts from a sustainability perspective, air quality, socioeconomic impacts, I would think it's going to improve the job market out here. What we see in healthcare is anytime there's a barrier even getting to an appointment, it brings down the health, right? And so there's a lot of different impacts that can come from this that could positively impact the health of the Western Mass community and the community at large, in a larger perspective as well in Massachusetts. And so I've shared with the team some of what we do as a nonprofit organization. We're required to do a community health needs assessment. I've shared some of that information with the team. And I guess as we look at these, I would ask that we just dig into that data. What are the socioeconomic impacts? How can these help with the health of our community? And come forward in that regard, which to me just sort of then just continues to spin things in a positive direction for our region, our health, our economy.
Does
Thank
that
you.
lead you to any particular service models at this point, or is it too early for you?
I think it's too early.
Okay,
It's obviously the price impacts
right.
quite a bit with some of these, but very,
But it looks like
very encouraged.
this data is very important to any recommendation you would make or develop.
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think from the very beginning, the town of Palmer was grateful to have a seat at the table here. Definitely to speak the voice of the necessity for servicing the rural transportation areas. To have an intermediate stop between Worcester and Springfield is truly the only option I see to serve the state of Massachusetts, Western Mass in particular. So the priority would be an intermediate stop. Obviously, I think many people from Palmer and the region have spoken out on that matter. The study that was presented to the MassDOT team that Palmer had contracted with the Center of Economic Development from UMass spoke to the 21 communities actually that will see a benefit from a rail stop in Palmer. And I was very happy to hear today that the service radius was extended to 40 miles. That clearly will include the UMass students in the 5 college areas, as well as really hit that 21 community area between Worcester and Springfield that we know will impact ridership. People currently really only have an option of driving their car if they have a car. It's severely underserved currently by public transportation. And if we do not have an intermediate stop, that will just continue to force residents to drive their car, not obviously taking those cars off the road. One of our goals is to reduce transportation emissions. So I think those are definitely some key points that I'd like to make.
So your alternatives are all Palmer alternatives.
Yes, but I also think, even between Springfield and Pittsfield, there needs to be the rural areas served. We cannot continue to believe that we're going to serve the state of Massachusetts with rail if we don't give some sort of access option to the communities in between the cities.
And how about phasing or any hybrids? So any thoughts on that?
Well, currently, I think Alternative 4 is getting a lot of attention, but then Alternative 5 seems to have some higher speeds, but Alternative 5 excludes Palmer as a stop. It also provides bus transportation to Pittsfield, which I think is unacceptable as well. So maybe a hybrid of the two.
Okay, great, thank you. Mr. Mayor?
You brought your cheering squad. Very good. First of all, I want to thank MassDOT and Governor Baker and administration for coming out here and holding this out in Springfield. I think we all agree that we have to think big and bold. This is a transformative project. There has to be the partnership from the federal government. We want to make sure that the feasibility that this can be done and that it's sustainable. I think that when you look back, it's back to the future, back to history. When you look at towns being settled, it was the river. And then in the 1700s, in the 1800s, it was the railroads. Boom towns occurred. And we have to think back along those lines. I also think, as we mentioned before, it is a statewide project, transformative. It can be very helpful to the Boston area to come out here to the Golden West. I do think that, if you're going to do a rail project, it needs to be a rail project. And you should look all the way from Boston to Pittsfield. I think that would be essential to do that. The other thing, criteria, I think, besides the housing, economic development, and job creation, on being realistic, the time frame of getting this done, but also the time frame of being on that train, that rail. Are you talking about, if it's feasible and sustainable and realistic, are you talking about a straight shoot from Boston, Pittsfield with maybe very limited stops? Are you talking about more of a longer time frame, which a lot of people now work right on the train? They'll be able to work with the hi-fi on that, the Wi-Fi. So that has to be put across, because I think some people might think, wow, if we can get there from an hour's time or an hour and a half time, that might not be realistic, because obviously everybody here is advocating for stops. And there's going to have to be some decisions made where stops should go and maybe where stops should not go if you want to make this sustainable and realistic. But I think if you're going to do it, and the stars could align, I believe Congress could work in a bipartisan fashion, obviously with Congressman Neal or Congressman McGovern also, and with the current administration or any upcoming administration. But it should be Boston, Pittsfield, and if you're going to do the rail, do it that way. We're very uniquely positioned with Union Station, so no matter what, it's going to come through Union Station. The last thing, again, I'll say is just a time frame. Are you going to be on that rail, that train for an hour and 15 minutes, or are you going to be on it for 3 hours and 15 minutes? So people realistically know on that. But the iron, now's the time to strike right now. I think you're going to see some federal infrastructure money that's going to come this way, and I know we can partner with Governor Baker on the state level, and I also think it was mentioned at the prior meeting that there are a lot of positive spin-offs that were not mentioned as far as the ridership revenues that will be brought to the table, which, again, I have to look at the bottom line of the budget, can offset some of those costs too. But if you're going to do it, we want to get something done, it should probably be all rail. Again, I appreciate MassDOT, Governor Baker, the representatives coming from near and far to be here. But this is our opportunity. This is our time, and we need to think big, bold, and diplomatically aggressive for the western part of the state.
Thank you.
I'd say thank you, but I don't think that was for me.
Yeah.
My name's Tim McGurthy. I'm with the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. You know, a lot of the items covered are all valid and important. The one thing I would add is the consideration that, as mentioned before, the connections statewide are an important part of the Partnership for Growth, which is the state's new economic development plan. The idea of regionalism and building on the assets within each of the areas of Massachusetts is critical. And I think as we look at East-West Rail, it is not just about moving employees into Boston for jobs or vice versa even, but building stronger connections within an economic development ecosystem where Springfield is proximate to Boston whether or not people are working in both cities at one time or in one or the other. The ability to kind of grow a local economy around a transit-oriented project like this is important and independent of, at some level, how many people are using it to get from one destination to the other. So I think kind of recognizing the value of this investment for its cross-state connection has a lot of vital importance that we should try not to overlook.
Serious.
There you go,
Let's
you
give
got
it up
some.
for the
Yeah.
Massachusetts Department of Housing and Economic Development. Thank you. So first I need to say that it's a little hard for me to talk about service priorities when some of the areas that need to be looked at will probably help us all make that decision. I stand firmly in advocacy with the Planning Commission's report and ideas about how to really look at the population that will be affected more deeply, to provide us more with clarification on how the study was done so we can better understand the numbers that you came up with. I happen to believe, and I don't think I'm unique, that the transportation crisis our state is facing makes this not only timely, but also an opportunity to deal with the climate emergency. And I think that we need to address the impact on climate in this report. I know in my district, it's on everyone's mind. People are changing their behaviors in order to address the climate emergency, and I think in Western Massachusetts, that will be the case throughout all 4 counties. In terms of service priorities, all rail, I don't think we should be expecting the Berkshires to be a sort of a child that doesn't get what everybody else is getting, especially when we're talking about regional equity. Our region consists of 4 counties, and they all need to be connected in order for economic development to happen. I also want to make sure that when we're looking at what are the priorities for service, that we're building in as many incentives for that service to be successful as possible. And what I mean by that is something that was mentioned earlier by the mayor. Trip times, I think, are important. Money, how much the ticket's going to cost and how much the state is willing to subsidize it. Convenience, and also commuter time. So initially, I was not someone who thought they were going to be a big supporter for high-speed rail. I was just like, just get us the rail. That's what we need. But when I saw the trip times and how they differed and how that ultimately is going to undermine ridership, I guess high-speed rail is definitely a priority for me because I think it's going to encourage people to get on the train. And that means people all over the state to get on the train. The possibilities of what this train can do for tourism and economic development in Western Mass, I think, are significant and also need to look at. And I would, I'm trying to read my notes here. So I guess in terms of what needs to be done and what stops need to happen, I can't speak to that until we see ridership. As you know, Amherst lost a train a couple of years ago. And so I'm a big believer in, and I know my constituents will travel for the train. They'll travel to catch the Valley Flyer. They'll travel to Springfield. They'll travel to Greenfield. I do think that the mile radius that was suggested is an improvement, but I think the time element actually speaks more to the region. People will travel for 45 minutes. 40 miles might not get you to the northern part of Amherst. So the northern part of the campus might not even be included in that for UMass. So I would urge you to look at those considerations. I think they really speak to what the region knows about what people will do to be able to get on the train, and that's what's going to make this train successful. I would also urge you, when you're thinking about what the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and Franklin County Planning Commission has brought, to expedite the review involved in looking at their considerations so that we lose as little time as possible in trying to make a more comprehensive, transparent study. I would hate to see the fact that we all recognize that the study has some areas that need to be addressed as an obstacle or a speed bump to ultimately getting this done. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you see any role for a hybrid or phasing, anything like that?
A hybrid between rail, yes. A hybrid with buses, no.
Oh, okay. Maureen, do you want to add
Pretty
anything?
sure I already had my time,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you. I'm John Hassey, and I'm here for the freight railroads. And, you know, they are still a fairly big deal in Massachusetts. We have over 1,000 miles of freight rail track, 11 or 12 different freight railroads, 15 to 16 million tons of freight that comes into the state, mainly into the state, and goes out of the state every year. Having said that, this is a great project. I'm a big fan of Senator Lesser, Mayor Sano. It's a transformative project. I just hope that at the end of it, you don't come out by diminishing freight rail or disrupting freight rail, because if you do that, if you diminish it, if you cast it aside, you're just going to end up with a lot more truck traffic, heavy trucks on our roads with bigger emissions. You know, a gallon of diesel fuel moves a ton of freight 432 miles. It's the most efficient way to move freight on land. And we have to keep that in mind as this process goes forward. For environment, for infrastructure, for growth. The state rail plan projects that we need almost a 30% increase in freight rail shipments by 2040 just to maintain the economy at its current pace. So that's my little bit. I'm done.
So I think what you're saying is high-speed rail and a separate CSX, separate from CSX line is better in terms of the. Okay. So I think a lot has been said already, and I guess the only thing I would add is I'm in favor of creating something that's equitable, provides equitable access to the whole Commonwealth. And I think we get there by providing high-speed rail. That would be something that would be relevant for multiple generations, 50, 100 years. I think we should be looking into how we best reduce our ecological footprint while we are at this. And no buses, just rail.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Tyre. I'm the mayor of the city of Pittsfield, and I join my good friend Mayor Sarno in saying that whatever we do ought to be bold and transformative, and this is the potential to be the largest, most meaningful infrastructure project in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in many generations. I hate to make comparisons, but those of us in the Berkshires helped fund the cost of the Big Dig, which benefited a small geographic area of our state, and we want to be part of the transportation solutions in the years ahead. A couple just quick observations, and then I'll be able to answer some of the questions for the panel. I love that there was the element of higher education has been added into assessing ridership. I think especially for Pittsfield and the Berkshires, giving our next generation of students greater access to colleges and universities across the Commonwealth has a lot of meaning, and vice versa. We have some great institutions in Pittsfield and the Berkshires that would benefit from rail that provides for higher education opportunities. I think it's important, and I'd emphasize the 45 minutes in the Berkshires versus 40 miles, because people are willing to drive a distance to connect. I think Massachusetts is a relatively small state, and so this idea of high-speed rail is certainly going to address workforce challenges and housing challenges. And I also appreciate the elements of the alternatives that respond to climate change. So when it comes to service priorities, and actually all 4 of these questions, no bus. The city of Pittsfield does not want to have to access transportation by getting on a bus. So that's not one of those things that I'm willing to trade. So I agree that high speed, frequent, fast, the ability to travel round trip from Pittsfield to Boston is my service priorities, including how this will connect to the Berkshire Flyer, which Senator Hines has been leading the way on. And this is going to expand travel between New York City, Pittsfield, and then onward to Boston. So narrowing down the final 3, obviously, again, no buses. It's pretty much all the same categories. But overall, moving travelers with ease and efficiency across the state is how we could narrow that down. And the hybrids, anything that doesn't include a bus or long travel times. So those are the elements that I'm especially interested in following. I have to say that as a citizen of the Commonwealth, as someone in a leadership position, I really feel like Alternative 6, high-speed rail, is going to have the boldest, most transformative, and generational impact for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and will set our state apart from anyone else in New England and in the Northeast. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question for people to think about is, I know high speed is the preference for many people, but as a phasing or other alternative, if it's not high speed, is that still acceptable? Is it something people are willing to consider? I mean, the travel time from New Bedford, Fall River is going to be 88 to 90 minutes is the estimate. And people down there are still thrilled because they spend 2 to 2.5 hours each way on Route 24. So I'm just interested in adding, let's talk about the other options as well.
So if high speed starts in the Berkshires and makes its way to Springfield, that would be a good alternative. But I do feel that if we are going to do this kind of major investment, travel times matter. We live in a fast-paced society. People want to move quickly and efficiently, whether it's on the internet or on their feet or around their community, around their Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. First of all, thanks to Astrid and the project team. I agree that this is it's been an incredibly difficult process, and to have this kind of feedback and to have you come in and already say you're updating ridership forecasting to include induced and the like. It's I appreciate that you're kind of taking a step back on a couple of items that have been highlighted by the advisory committee. There has a lot that's been said. I think what I'll focus on is maybe when you're looking at the economic and demographic benefits, not just to the west, but to the state. I think that's something that really feels like we're at a turning point in this project where the globe and everybody is starting to recognize that as an important piece of this process. And that kind of starts to tie into other things, including travel time. And in my head, we can say that what does it mean to have a travel time of less than 2 hours? It's hard for us to go into meetings in Boston without the first 15 minutes, dedicated to talking about how long it's taken everybody to get to that meeting. And so if that means it's an hour and 45 minutes, how does that translate into what's attractive to people who are actually shifting their own calculations and equations on are they going to take a train? Are they going to buy a house outside and still work? I feel like that's a difficult issue to get at from an analysis perspective, but it feels like it's a very real one. And so for me, it's not, it's hard to overstate the importance of that will have on the entire Commonwealth. Also, the intercity transportation, I don't feel like that's been emphasized enough, and how this would connect the economies of Worcester, Springfield, and Pittsfield, and how that would certainly help each of those cities. Is pretty significant, and I haven't really heard that come out substantially. I will say the cost, when we're starting to get to now narrowing down to the three, I will say no bus, just so that word gets bigger on the cloud. It looked like a different language, no bus, so we'll take it. No bus, and then option 6 really strikes me as how are you going to future-proof a project like this, and electric. I can imagine 10 years from now being saying, why the heck did we invest in a diesel train? And electric, high speed, really seems like it's what hits the generational transformative impact. And I'm also not afraid of the price tag. Quite honestly, when we look at the cost of these major transportation projects that have been impacting, albeit the capital city, when you're talking about a statewide transportation project, that seems imminently possible, especially at a time when we're talking about new revenue for servicing bonds, whether it's through TCI or other transportation revenue that's being considered in the legislature and the administration. And the hybrid piece, I suppose there have been some interesting conversations emerging at this table and on the margins around, do you start with the high speed and the Pittsfield portion, while the Springfield to Boston portion is making adjustments for increasing until the high-speed train gets there, or because you're talking about certain different tracks, it seems like you could do a simultaneous. I know that probably adds to costs, but there's some clear, interesting trade-offs. And we already heard about the other one, option 5, with enhancements from Springfield to Boston, but not having a bus from Pittsfield to Springfield. Did we mention no bus?
I was going to say, we're just going to write no bus here. So is there anyone in favor of the bus? Okay. All right.
Jonathan Butler, 1 Berkshire. Again, I'll be really brief because I already had some moments up front, but I'll just add that I think options 4, 5, and 6 without bus all appear to be worth continuing to review. I think option 6, the question is, with that significant cost, it really points out that we need to better understand the overall demand statewide. An investment like that would be, generational in nature, and certainly it'd have to be a statewide policy decision. But I think when you look at the way that we suffer or we struggle differently on the different sides of the state, in the West we're in many ways economically disconnected. Our population's either being thinned out or it's stagnant. In the East, people are spending 1 to 2 hours in the morning and in the afternoon commuting to a home that costs 2 or 3 times what they'd be able to purchase in Western Massachusetts. So there's something about that begs the term silver bullet. Is there an opportunity for a statewide generational policy decision that everybody wins with?
Thank you. You get an A for giving me 3 alternatives just right off the bat. Thank you, Jonathan.
Good afternoon. My
Yeah.
name is Cleet Coos,
Thank you,
representing Berkshire Regional Planning. Kind of batting cleanup here for the Berkshire delegation. But as a team player, I have to reiterate, no bus. That'll probably be the last time you hear that this afternoon. Probably not.
The big star.
I think that, you know, as the study continues, I think some of the criteria that needs to be looked at in terms of developing and selecting alternatives really has to reflect a lot of the items that have been voiced this afternoon. You know, criteria related to job access, housing availability, housing affordability, emission reductions, congestion reduction, travel time savings, economic development are some criteria. And I think it's also important, you know, we heard a little bit about regional equity. A lot of transportation projects are required to look at environmental justice, and I'm certain that our area as well as other areas will benefit by having criteria included in this study effort on that. Obviously, I think that if we're going to do it right. I think that alternative 6 probably is the most viable option, recognizing that it's probably going to take some time to get there, but things typically will move quickly once the train leaves the station, pardon the pun. I think that you know, we want to have a reliable service that provides emission reduction, travel savings, and really fosters a lot of these items that we've spoken about. And want to reiterate that it probably would be best taking the approach of starting from the western part of the state and moving this towards Springfield. And that'll allow for other improvements to get in place in the South Station.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to thank the team for all the work that you've done. I know that this has been yeomen and yeowomen's work, so thank you for everything that you have done. Hopefully everybody has gotten the Western Mass Rail Coalition handout. Ben, has everybody gotten this handout in there? Okay, great. They've done a lot of great work as well. You'll see some interesting stuff in there. I won't reinvent the wheel. I will say, in terms of me personally, if there's not an intermediate stop somewhere, it's a deal breaker for me in terms of recommendations, because my biggest fear is that if it's not in this report, then it ain't going to happen. So if we don't include it here in some way, shape, or form, I could see that it's very easily in the future going to be completely ignored. So that's my biggest concern. I love Alternative 6. You know, it's great. High-speed rail, wonderful. It's bold, it's beautiful, and I'm not scared by price tags at all. But time is something that I am concerned with. If it takes 20 years to get Alternative 6 here, and I can write you a check tomorrow, Alternative 6 is not a viable option. Mm-hmm. We've brought up the housing crisis that's going on in Massachusetts. That crisis is going on yesterday in Massachusetts. So in terms of my thought process on this, we need to be thinking about something that is going to get up and running sooner rather than later. So, you know, so I'm split on this idea because I want to get innovative, I want to get modern, I want to get high speed, but at the same time, I know that it's going to take a lot of time in order to get there. So I hope that we are going to look at something that is going to get up and running sooner than later. So with respect to time, what I'd like to see is an idea of what these components are going to take in terms of time. If we're going to do upgrades on existing lines that are shared with freight, what's it going to take in order to get there? Permitting, agreements, making the investment to do those upgrades. What are we looking at in terms of time? Are we talking 2 years, 5 years? Some people are saying 15 years for some of these upgrades. I need to get a sense, I think, to be comfortable at the end of the day of saying, okay, I'm logically looking at, we want to get East-West Rail moving. We want it to impact the economy. We want it to help students. We want it to help housing. We want it to help our communities. We want to get people from Eastern West to Western Mass and vice versa for all different kinds of reasons. But I want to know what that means in terms of time. And I recognize the fact that we can't answer all those questions here today. Mm-hmm. And even in an analysis, in some of those cases, we can't get all the answers. But to get a rough idea of what that timeline is. And I think that timeline will impact people's opinions in terms of what they will support by the end of this study. If we need to be here longer than we anticipated, I'm all for that, and I hope everybody else here is for that as well. As much as we'd like to get this done by the spring of this year, I think if we're going to do this, we've got to do it right. We have other informations out there, we have other studies out there, but at the end of the day, I think that we are better off to spend more time to get accurate information in terms of what we're looking for. But I just cannot stress that enough. What is it going to take to get these different things done? And I think that will impact everybody's decision if we can kind of see it, and even if it's in components. So if our final recommendations, 1, 2, and 3, are an amalgam of some of those things that have already been talked about, let's try and determine what those different things are going to take in terms of time that we can plug right into an alternative 1, 2, and 3. In other words, if we know we're going to have to do upgrades in every one of those recommendations, okay, at least we're going to know in these recommendations it's going to take us this amount of time to do X, Y, and Z. But I think that's hugely important because we all are here for a reason. We have such a good broad cross-section of people sitting at this table. We all have different ideas. We all have different ways about getting there. But I think our vision in general is all the same. We want to increase that connectivity. We want to increase that access in terms of what people can use. And I would also say in terms of time spent on a train, and I think the mayors have both said this, and some of my legislative colleagues have said this as well, in terms of the time that is spent on these trips. Yeah, we'd like to get people there as fast as possible. But I do believe that people would be willing to sacrifice some of that time, knowing that instead of sitting in your car driving, you can be on your laptop doing work, or you can do a number of different things that you wouldn't be able to if you were a driver in a car. So I do believe that people in Western Massachusetts will make a sacrifice on some time, not an eternity of time, but they will make a sacrifice on some of that time just for the fact that they have an alternative transportation choice so that they can get from point A to point B. I think that's extremely important.
Thank you. That's exactly what we're looking for, that kind of thought, yeah. And I'll, forgive me for another South Coast Rail story, but the phase 1 construction is going to take 4 years. The full build will take more than 10 years. By the time the full build would probably be permitted and ready to go to construction, more than 850,000 people will have ridden the train from New Bedford, Fall River, and Taunton to Boston. And again, opening up that housing market for folks from Boston who, would like to be in a housing market that's much more realistic. So thank you. Those are the kinds of comments that are very helpful. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Eric Lester, State Center for the 1st Hampden and Hampshire District. Just ditto to everything that's been said, just a couple of points to build off of. First, really integrating this ridership analysis into the final MassDOT report is essential. I think a lot of us share a lot of skepticism about how the ridership numbers were reached in the draft that was presented a few weeks ago. They don't really seem to be attached to just reality or to what previous studies have indicated. I think updating and looking at the Portland-Boston link is much more of an apt comparison than, frankly, Wallingford-Springfield, as well as Providence-Boston and Worcester-Boston, which are all good test cases. And I think that this report does a good job outlining, just how much potential there is around ridership. And again, a really thorough and robust, induced demand analysis, I think, is essential, because the whole argument for this project is to change the trends in the state rather than to just follow them. And on that, I think that there needs to be some acknowledgement or analysis of what the cost is and what the state looks like without this project, which means if we stay on the status quo and on the trajectory that we're on, which is housing prices year over year in the Boston area continuing to spiral out of control. The congestion report that was just released by MassDOT shows and documents that the congestion crisis has gotten worse and worse year after year. And of course, we're facing a crisis around an aging population and around population loss in Western Mass. There's a cost to that too, if that doesn't change in the foreseeable future. Just to reiterate what my colleague Rep. Dom said about the climate impacts, essential, completely missing. The Senate just passed the 2050 net zero bill. I know the governor in his State of the State announced the commitment, Massachusetts net zero by 2050. There's frankly just no way that's real unless we get people out of cars and invest in rail. And then finally, connected to the ridership numbers, the whole kind of prism and orientation I think needs to change. rather than this being viewed as a project for Western Mass, this needs to be viewed as a statewide infrastructure investment. So what does the demand analysis look like in Boston? What's the housing impact in Boston? And engaging more Boston stakeholders, I think, is really essential. I know Jonathan mentioned a Boston hearing. There's very broad cross-section of Central and Western Mass. I know there's some folks from Metro West. There's no one from Boston. So I think having Boston's voice integrated into this is going to be important as well, because as was pointed out, this is going to be an escape valve, so to speak, a pressure escape for the crisis they're facing around congestion and housing.
Thank you, Senator.
Hi, I'm Sandra Sheehan from the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority. I cringe every time you say no bus. Yeah, I know.
We could say it in unison, so then.
No, I meant it because we run a bus system.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think I appreciate the fact that you're setting up a meeting with the different regional planning agencies. I think that's going to make a big difference. As I think that data, and while you address the concerns that have been brought up, will change the summary of the alternatives, and I think it will narrow down the priorities. And I think they will stand up more than what they do right now. And you asked what the service priorities. I think when we were in the commission for the future of transportation, one of the things that was discussed was equity. Equity among the whole Commonwealth and the ability of everyone to have the opportunity to have mobility options and connections, and I think that's very important. The criteria, I think it was mentioned before, convenience. As a public transportation provider, if we don't provide convenience service, no one is going to use it. And convenience can be defined differently for different people. We mentioned, it was talked about the time. It was also talked about what you can do during that time, so it could take longer, but if your time is productive, then people won't mind it. So I think it just needs to be defined on what the convenience is for different people. The trade-offs, I think one of the things, the time frame, I think that's very important. I think one of the things, integration of services. As it was mentioned, in our regions, the Western Mass, the distances are very great. I mean, for instance, where I live, it takes 30 minutes to get to the supermarket, and that's just a normal trip. And it's the same for the universities. The university and the 5 colleges and all the other schools are, 40, 45 minutes away from Palmer, almost 45 minutes up to an hour from Springfield. So those distances need to be taken into consideration, and I think when you talk about integration, it's not only, it's how they're going to get to the stations, whether it's a different type of service or it's, something that is provided, but it's, when you look at how far the region can reach out, I think all those need to be taken into consideration. We're very spread out.
But
I mean, PVTA
that could be
itself-
bus, right?
Yeah, oh, yes,
Right,
of course,
yes.
of course.
Bus is okay there,
Yes,
right.
yes. That's why I said integration with the different modes. But it is a far-reaching area. I mean, our area is 600 square miles, and it's a lot of rural areas that need to be served. Some of the things that I think a phased approach might be something that, I mean, I know that a section on the table say no, but I think when you're trying to implement a project, that if you phase some portions of it and you see how well it does, then you can then carry the rest of it. I think that's something that should be considered. And I think that's it.
Right, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liz Quigley with Congressman Neal's office. The Congressman would like to thank Governor Baker, Secretary Pollack, the project team, and the advisory committee for all the work that's been put in. Congressman Neal is very encouraged by the study and the information that he's been provided so far. He is committed to moving infrastructure forward on a federal level, and this rail line is a top priority for him. He knows that the federal government is going to be an essential partner in seeing this come to fruition, and he's not shying away from any of the costs, and he's very committed to this. There's more information that's needed to move forward in picking a shortlist option, taking a deeper look into the ridership numbers, environmental concerns, economic development, and revenue projections will be beneficial to help narrowing that down. making this study equitable for the entire state, which includes rail options to the entire state, especially the Berkshires. But at the end of the day, I think Congressman Neal is most looking forward to a study that has a clear path forward to build an east-west rail line at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Melissa with Senator Markey's office. My federal partners have mentioned many of the things that I would have said, so thank you. I would say that the top two things that Senator Markey would want to get across is one, equity, which we've talked about quite a bit, and just pointing out that East-West Rail would enhance opportunity for everybody in Massachusetts, not just for those of us out here. And the second point for Senator Markey is just focusing more in the study on the environmental impacts, because I think that that area could really use some beefing up, and we'll see that this project could really, really help us with a lot of different projects we're working on in this state.
Good afternoon, Pat Carnevale, Governor's Office. In fairness to the group, I'm from Berkshire County, Pittsfield, so I kind of go with my colleagues from Pittsfield, but that's not on record. First of all, I want to say thank you to the regional planning groups, One Berkshire, Senator Hines. Thank you for the additional information. That was helpful, and I think it's critical for us to make any further decisions. I also want to add, Rep. Smola, I think that's important. I think that piece has been missed. What is realistic? What's the time frame? You know, if we're talking 20 years, is that really realistic? Yes, we want the best product, but I think we all have to be realistic too. And those are some of the things I'll bring back to the governor, undersecretary. I know we'll all meet together with the other secretaries and brief the governor. But I think until we make get all the final information, I don't think it's fair for us to, again, on my personal side, no bus, because I live in the Pittsfield and I don't want these guys to lynch me up at the grocery store or anything. But otherwise, I think it's helpful to all the additional information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan Rascott from the city of Worcester. I'm not, frankly, in a position right now to endorse any of the given plans. I will just say that on a local level, we have certainly seen the impact that improved passenger ridership can have with the heart-to-hub rail, obviously, heart-to-hub train that gets us into Boston, in and out of Boston a couple times a day in around an hour. I think it's an hour 5. That has, I think, had the effect of, regardless of how many people it's moving on a given day, I think it has had a positive impact just as far as changing people's minds about what their options are when they're looking for places to work, places to live. Because once you start saying Worcester to Boston in about an hour, that's when people start paying attention. So that's been one of the positive things that we've seen on a local level, just from the increase in passenger rail.
Thank you. Paul Matthews with the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. I started my service on this committee representing the 495 Metro West Partnership, but I'm currently representing the Worcester Research Bureau. It probably comes as no surprise that representing the Research Bureau, I do want to commend the hard work that's gone into the data, both on the part of the MassDOT representatives, the consultancy team, and also Jonathan and the team that shared some additional perspective. The LEHD commuting data is, I think, critical to this conversation. And I also want to point out, wearing a few different hats here, as someone who served on the Rail Vision Committee for MassDOT, I do understand and appreciate the level of complexity at work, as MassDOT is also single-handedly attempting to redesign the commuter rail system. And these two projects, it should be noted, are intertwined. Thus far, a lot of the engineering and operational focus has understandably been Worcester West. I would point out the Worcester-Framingham line from Worcester to the east is critical to the success of this project. And there is a lot of moving parts currently ongoing on that, not only the Rail Vision side and the different operating models for commuter rail, but also the work MassDOT has been doing at Union Station, as well as the potential third track study, which I know a lot of work has gone into behind the scenes and would offer critical capacity improvements to that line that I suspect are absolutely imperative in order to accommodate East-West Rail. That project, by the way, does not have a modest price tag either, nor a quick timeline. And I think that really speaks to the point that some of my colleagues have raised regarding realistically needing a conversation about phasing. I think whether you look at the Downeaster, you look at South Coast Rail, you look at the other projects that have been undertaken as rail projects, including, incidentally, the Worcester-Framingham line. I started my career when the line expanded in 1994, and I've watched it expand. To Dan's very compelling point, the line itself provides a pretty compelling argument for induced ridership and the potential growth over time. That being said, if you look at how that line has grown from Framingham West, it's been a 25-year period of steady expansion. This absolutely offers the potential for dramatic and very needed investment in east-west service, but the fact remains it will take time. I think we all recognize it's going to take a lot of money, but it's important when we get to the end of this project, we have the opportunity to sort of weigh a realistic phasing. Because I think, in fairness to MassDOT, we all recognize no one has a magic wand and can make all of this happen immediately. Our rail projects in the state have a lengthy history of being needed, being valued, but taking time. I think to the time point, I was looking at the time frame for this study, which is helpfully included in the package. I'm expecting we're going to get a modified timeline at some point, given the extensive data work that's going to be done. And I do think it's important this be done right, rather than keeping to the original time frame if it's unreachable. The other few points I would raise are relative to comments I've raised earlier in this process. One is my colleague Dan was much more tactful than me, but I would point out from a realistic standpoint, Heart to Hub, which is express service from Worcester to Boston, is 65 minutes. And I've raised that in prior meetings, as has Dan, as has Senator Chandler's office. So that's a very real trade-off we're going to have to work with, as well as the fact that some of the data that got pointed out by Jonathan and the team about employment, I very much appreciate Worcester was included in that, as is Boston. I would point out, while this does not anticipate it, there are potential other employment commuting nodes, like Metro West, 495. And there are other potential areas that could benefit, while the state is simultaneously dealing with the idea of the Grand Junction connection into Cambridge, the West Station. There are a lot of, as I said, moving parts on this, and I think it's important from a timing standpoint, we position this for federal success, which is why I really want to commend our federal colleagues, particularly Senator Markey, Representative McGovern, and Representative Neal. Both Representative Neal and Representative McGovern's offices have been integral to this date, and I think we all recognize that any pending federal package is going to require House and Senate leadership. So it's very much appreciated that they're here every day, every meeting, and contributing. To that point, I look forward to getting more data as befitting the Research Bureau, and I appreciate the amount of work the state is investing in this as you're simultaneously dealing with changing the rail system in other parts as well.
Good afternoon, Sujata here from Central Mass Regional Planning Commission. As part of our regional long-range transportation plan, we did list Worcester to Springfield as one of our priorities for rail, so I definitely support that. And criteria for narrowing it down, again, there are a number of performance metrics that have to be looked at. I know it's a combination of what a lot of people have already spoken about here, equity, all the way from equity to time frame, time to get into Boston on a train, ridership projections, a lot of stuff. Willing to, as a regional planning agency, willing to help out with the metrics if there's a need, because we do that on a regular basis to prioritize projects. As far as trade-offs go, phasing is something we think is something to keep in mind, especially given the cost of this project. And I know for a regular transit user, bus is a taboo word, but I will point out too the Logan Express, which is the most successful bus service we have, which leaves Framingham and goes into Boston. I'm like, that bus is so packed. So if it is the right kind of bus, I think, it is not a bad option to exclude while you're phasing this project. So that's just my personal opinion. And then definitely hybrids can be considered, like alternative 5 with an inclusion of train would be an option that was not considered. So I know once the criteria are set, the final 3 might be easier to narrow down. I don't have much on that. Thank you.
So Kim Robinson with the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and I'd like to say thank you very much to MassDOT for all the work that you have done on this, and also for the opportunity to be able to get together and discuss some of the numbers and work that has been done in conjunction with the presentation that was done earlier today. Thank you both for your efforts there as well. So we are a co-signer onto that presentation and support taking a look at ridership numbers, station radii, putting in a stadium, take that for what it's worth, just kidding. I think that the questions that are up on the screen are pretty big questions. And I know I, for one, would appreciate the opportunity to be able to revisit them once we have the conversation regarding the data and projections and assumptions in the meeting that we've been talking about. I agree with others that have brought up that perhaps the criteria will become even more apparent through that process. So I know I would appreciate that. I think the one thing I would also mention that could be very helpful is a discussion regarding the economic opportunities that could potentially be involved with any of the alternatives that we're discussing. I think that there's many case studies across the country that say, for instance, the discussion of implementation of transit-oriented development. You know, we should be talking about that now as we're also talking about this type of development of transit. So I would like to see that. Other than that, I look forward to the additional discussion around numbers and moving forward from there. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy Creed, Springfield Regional Chamber. Great comments for everyone in the room. I'm not sure I can really add too much more. We support our friends in One Berkshire. We think it's important if we're talking equity across the state. They are within this state. So we will firmly believe that we should go all the way to the west. So I appreciate that because it is east-west rail, not east-Springfield rail. I also want to mention that I think it's important, and I agree with John, that we need to make sure that this is in conjunction with a freight strategy. I want to make sure we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I would appreciate very much the economic impact analysis before I actually made some real decisions on which alternatives. We are looking at 4, 5, and 6, though, and a hybrid between 4 and 5. But I think it's really important, especially from a business community perspective, and I respectfully say this to my friends in the Senate and in the House, that when we look at projects like this and we look at, I hear subsidize, I immediately think being subsidized by the business community. So I just respectfully ask folks to take that into consideration where we're looking at the cost. Thank you.
Thank you. Travis Pollock of Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I apologize, I missed the last meeting, although I did read the summary, I saw the presentation, and I did watch part of it on YouTube, so thank you for doing that. So since I missed the last meeting, I apologize if some of the things I'm going to be talking about might be things that you've talked about already. I will say MAPC does support this project very much, and I will also say that some of my comments here are from before I came here to Massachusetts, I worked for 20 years in North Carolina with North Carolina DOT and as a consultant on intercity rail, statewide rail issues. So that's my background on this. I agree it's good to have, I think, a long-term vision for what you want, and then it's good to have a way of a phased approach to try to reach that vision. And that's what we did in North Carolina. Our vision has always been Raleigh to Charlotte, maybe 2.5-hour train trip one day with about 8 round trips. We started with 0 round trips, and then when it was 1 round trip, 4 hours. Then we got it to 2, and we got it to 3. Now it's about 3 hours round trip, doing the things like slowly improving the capacity of the railroad, increasing the frequencies. We've gone from a few hundred, they went from I say we, like I used to live there, but went from a few 100,000 to now over 1 million riders in the state, so on intercity rail, because of the vision they had of this is what they want to do, and by having the phased approach to build it. I think it's, in terms of like service priorities, I think, so as I say, a vision and then a phased approach that can get you there. I would say also in terms of trade-offs, things that can be done sooner rather than later. In terms of criteria, I would say, are there things you can do that really help both passenger and freight? Because again, in North Carolina, when we had sections between Raleigh and Charlotte that were single track with no signaling system whatsoever, with maximum speeds of like 45 mile an hour, is awful. But double tracking, improving the speeds, that helped Norfolk Southern, it helps Amtrak, it helps everyone. So I would, suggest that be considered as well. I think if you have that long-term vision about what you can do to upgrade the corridor for all the users over time, you can have these distinct pieces that you can design and do, and then when the federal funding comes along, you have things that are very close to shovel-ready, and I think that's something that should be considered as well. So I would just recommend that those things be considered. In terms of, I think the economic development is really important. I think in terms of also criteria, things that can get you those convenient start and travel times. So even those first few frequencies that you might add, those round trips, they have to be really convenient for a business traveler. I used to travel in North Carolina, Raleigh, Charlotte, 7 a.m. or set like 7:30 train, get me into Raleigh by 3 hours later at 10:30. I could be at business meetings all day, and after just back-to-back business meetings, hop on a train at 5:30 and be back in Charlotte in 3 hours, and it was great. And all that time, there's Wi-Fi. It's much more productive, and so even if you don't have the speed that you're looking for right away, that productivity is really important. And I think if you can have something that's car competitive initially, I think that's a good first step. So I'm glad to see that the ridership is being looked at again. I was, again, looking at some of the numbers we had in North Carolina for some of the trains. We started with like one round trip. They were much higher than the ridership you're showing on some of these alternatives. So, so I think it's really important that we consider the additional ridership and look at that in terms of the induced demand. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Did we miss any advisory committee members who came in late? Where everyone got to speak? Okay, so let me try to summarize. First of all, everyone would like to get some more information on ridership and things like travel time and economic development. A lot of issues that, when you do a planning study like this, I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's a bit like getting a new kitchen in your house. You start at a certain point where you say, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to get to Boston in, an hour and 15 minutes, and that's it. We don't care how we do it. When my husband and I argued over a kitchen about 10 years ago, I had really high expectations. I was really happy at the end, but I know that when we started, we didn't know everything, and we had to make a tier set of decisions. And we did that, and he got his 6-burner stove, and I got my wine fridge, so I was happy in the end. But I think we've had some great suggestions today, but I think we need to understand we are peeling down the layers, and that the team is dedicated to providing you the information that you really want. So I think it's really important you understand that we're hearing you, and you are going to get some more information. The other thing I've heard today was clearly that bus has a very limited role, but it can be successful. It's not the way people want to connect to Pittsfield, but it's not completely poison for some people in the room, so that's good to hear. I've heard a lot of really good things about equity, about this being an important entire Commonwealth project. Our elected officials not being afraid of an expensive project, which is really exciting. Phasing, I mean, a lot of people towards later on in the conversation brought up phasing, and I think it's really helpful because, it may well be that though we're not afraid of the price tag, we have to think about phasing or hybrids. I think the comments about being realistic about what can be done and providing a service that can start, these are these are just experiences that I'm sharing with you from projects over many years. What else am I missing that's really urgent? Anybody? You got most of it there? I think there's a long list of things about climate. equity, and things that we definitely are going to be a part of this project. And I think you've all brought them up, and we appreciate that you've covered a lot of the important issues to making a decision and series of recommendations. So anyone else on the team want to add something at this point? No? All right. We do have some time for public comment here at the end of the meeting. So let's see, a microphone. Sarah's got the microphone. What I will do is ask you to be as brief as you can, maybe 2 or 3 minutes at most, so that as many people who want to speak are able to do so. I will note that we have been taking notes. I've been taking them on the pad, as you saw, and Emily is writing away on her computer, as are other members of the staff, so we will have very detailed notes. And this lady right here, I think, raised her hand first.
Hello, Ann Miller from Citizens for Palmer Rail Stop. I just want to address what I view as a couple possible misunderstandings, maybe not among the public at large, maybe not among the advisory committee, but I do feel there's a little bit of, I'm a little concerned about the idea that rail has to either be absolutely European-style high-speed, or we're talking about an old-fashioned slow diesel locomotive. I don't think that's a realistic comparison. I would point out electrified rail is not necessarily the future. There's quite a few technologies out there running on existing rights of way. Also, of course, diesel locomotives are much greener than they used to be. And I'm sure there's people who could point out the technical aspect of that. For instance, the Bright Line, I don't know if you've heard of it in Florida, has been a 70-mile-an-hour service. They are currently doing upgrades on the existing right-of-way that would raise that to 120 miles per hour. So I think that the assumption that it's an either-or thing is a false assumption. I just want to say that. The other thing I would like to point out is the assumption that people will not use the train unless it's the exact same time, or preferably shorter than driving their car, is a demonstrably false assumption. Myself, I commuted on the train every day north of Boston. I lived on the North Shore. It was an hour and a half from my North Shore home to my workplace in Boston. Now, it's true, in theory, I could drive it in the middle of the night at half that speed, but that really wasn't a useful option to me because the traffic was very unpredictable. And frankly, I got a lot of work done on the train, and at that time it did not have Wi-Fi. So it was really quite useful to me. I also commuted from Cape Cod to Boston. That was a roughly 2-hour commute, occasionally even longer. Again, I picked that location because there was a bus there. So when I moved to Palmer from the Boston area, and it was for the reasons you guys are talking about, my husband and I had tried for 3 years to buy a condo in the Boston area. And as librarians, we were completely priced out, even though we were academic librarians, pretty much at the top of our field. So we moved out to Palmer because we got jobs at the 5 colleges. Now, my work there was ultimately eliminated and outsourced, the whole type of work I did. And I ended up working for an outsourcing company in the Hartford area. For a long time, I actually drove to Springfield, even though there's a train station in Palmer, but no train. So I drove to Springfield and took that train. So what I'm saying is, human behavior patterns may not be as predictable as you think. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll get you next.
Again, please try to keep them short so we can get everybody in as possible.
I'll be brief. Mike Egan from Palmer. I have a question about ridership numbers and the 40-mile radius that you take from Pittsfield or from Springfield. Has any consideration been given to the ridership numbers, increased ridership numbers in the Worcester area? If they're going to benefit, why aren't we looking at ridership numbers from a 40-mile radius around Worcester?
I saw some nodding there. Would that be included? Yes, we are. Yes, that'll be part of the next phase of stuff. Yes.
Mark Schapp, Lennox. There's 2 linchpins to this. Assuming that we're not going to do this high-speed rail operation down the middle of the Mass Pike, And I think we can pretty well be assured that no one's going to spend the money to do that option, at least not right away. So there are two linchpins to using the current route. One is getting a buy-in from the private freight railroad that owns the railroad west of Worcester, CSX, headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida. They are not part of this discussion in this room. They have never been part of these meetings, and we have no idea what they're going to do, whether they will partner or under what conditions. At some point, the DOT is going to have to come clean and tell us what CSX will do and under what conditions and whether we can afford those conditions. If we don't find out pretty soon, Mr. Britland and Ms. Glynn are going to come back here and say, well, sorry, we wasted a whole lot of money, and we wasted all your time, but CSX just slammed the door on us. And that's got to be ironed out sooner than later, and it should have been ironed out before this study ever began. We needed to know under what conditions CSX would partner for us to access their right-of-way. The other thing is South Station Boston. We know that South Station Boston is maxed out for train arrivals and departures during the peak commuting hours of the day during the week. There's been a plan afoot for a long time to move the post office and add, I think, 6 tracks and 5 platforms on the east side. DeVal Patrick was governor of this state for 8 years and never moved the needle 1 millimeter toward getting that done. Now, I don't know how many of you know about the project about to kick off above South Station. This big 50-story glass and steel ugly building above the open area in South Station, which has 2 transportation components, both of them antithetical to passenger rail. One, at the developer's expense, I read in the Boston Herald, the developer is going to pay to add more capacity to the bus station, something like 12 new bus bays. Why the developer has not been asked to take part in getting the post office moved and add the platform and track capacity, I can't understand. But it gets worse. They're going to add an underground parking garage with 895 car spaces. That seems to me could possibly end any ideas of building the north-south rail link. So it looks like the added track and platform capacity, which is absolutely essential to add more service, that's not going to happen. The north-south rail link's not going to happen, undermines this whole situation. We need some answers.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. I can tell you that the Tower 1, which is an essential part of improving some of the operation at South Station, there is a redesign of that underway, because I've been on that project. Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Matt Kibbe. I live in Sturbridge, Mass, and I'm right next to the Mass Pike. And I like to dream big. I taught technology education, and I had kids talking about maglev, and I know that China's doing that. And this would be a great time for our country, Massachusetts combined with the federal government, to subsidize and do something really good and bring us up to date with the world. And I say go all the way to Albany, but if that's not the case, at least do a double track elevated rail like Disney World with sides in all the places you want to stop, and have rail that goes straight to Boston from Pittsfield and other ones that stop along the way with the sides. It will alleviate the traffic congestion. But go, if we're possible, down to Mass Pike, and I say dream big like Disney.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Kara Radvins. I'm with the Capital Region Council of Governments down in Hartford. We were a co-signer on the presentation earlier today, and I just wanted to reiterate our support of this effort, and just to acknowledge that there is probably a significant number of folks from our region who would be interested in this connection as well. So we are excited to see the 40-mile radius from Springfield, which does capture our region more meaningfully.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Fryer. I'm from Dover, Massachusetts, near Boston. First, I'd like to say that I think Senator Lesser made an excellent point about you're selling yourselves short. This is going to be as important to Boston and Metro West as it will be to the western part of the state. Boston is just running out of affordable housing, and it's running out of affordable land for business as well. These businesses can come to Worcester and Springfield if they can get there quickly and easily. So I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. But I'm really here today to ask you to review my proposal, which I call Alternative 7. And I have a website which you can look at, www.alternative7.net, so I won't bore you with it all, but I can say that it will provide high-speed rail and travel times of 2 hours from Pittsfield to Boston, 60 minutes from Springfield to Boston, 30 minutes from Worcester to Boston. It will cost half the price of alternate 6, and it will have a fraction of the environmental impact of any of the other options. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but alternative7.net. Thank you.
Thank you. Some more folks over here? Yeah.
Dominic Villani from Northern Berkshire Hills. Just to reiterate some points, equity to the western portion of the state, big. I'm a small property manager and interested and concerned with so many legislative matters, and wish I could just zip myself down to Beacon Hill and participate. It's very difficult given the set of circumstances we have today. And today I tried to get here in time and was held up on the pike with traffic. So that and along with weather conditions is something that we deal with on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Ben Hood. I'm from the Citizens for Palmer Rail Stop. I'm not speaking on my own behalf today, which I'm sure will come as a relief to everybody. So this is an email that came in this morning to our palmertrain@gmail.com account. And I'm just going to read it because it actually answers the question about which alternatives someone would like to go forward, and you'll understand who he is in a minute. I am the grad student from UMass. This is not me, so it's David Feit is his name. I am the grad student from UMass who spoke briefly at the last public hearing about my family's struggle to finish my degree. I am finishing getting my master's in architecture and work for the university as part of a work-study program. I had hoped to attend the meeting today and offer the following thoughts as a young building professional, but I am ill. There is a lot of good stuff in option 5. I believe we should look at an option where we do option 5 between Springfield and Boston, option 4 between Pittsfield and Springfield, and add back the Chester-Palmer stops. We should also look at option 4 from Pittsfield to Springfield and option 6 from Springfield to Boston with stops in Palmer and Chester. I guesstimate these would cost $7 and $14 billion respectively. The advisory committee generally needs to offer us a real option that is in this price range. 5 options for less than $5 billion and 1 for $25 billion seems we missed something along the way. His next point. At the same time, the advisory committee needs to offer at least one proposal next time that can be accomplished without federal funding. His third point. The committee should not present any options at the next meeting which leave out any of the communities expressing strong desire at this point. Their doing this at the last meeting was extremely unhelpful and led to emotion instead of substantive conversation. And this is almost his last point. The committee should release detailed summaries of each final option several hours before the hearing. I wanted to see this information beforehand and spend an hour looking. I suspect the majority of people at the meeting were presented with that information for the first time in the room. What happened at the public hearing is not best practice for presenting people with information, and the planners who are working with the state know that from their own educations. The 3-page statement we were given should have been the start of a much longer package we could review before the meeting. Last point, the committee should commit to releasing detailed reports beforehand at the meeting today. Every week I get detailed meeting agendas before critical meetings on major state construction projects. This is no different. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Dave Pierce from Chester. I just wanted to share a little bit of experience I've had historically with this particular problem. back in the 90s, our group, Chester Railway Station, worked with a couple of other outfits, Mystic Valley Railway Society and the Amherst Railway Society, and we ran a series of excursions, just tourist trains, from Boston to Albany and return, about a 3-hour round trip, same speed approximately as what Amtrak's doing today, about 45 miles an hour. We used Amtrak and T equipment on various trips on the weekends when they were idled. So there was no problem with any compatibility with equipment or the curves being too sharp. We never had any trouble. All trains were full. We ran about 10-car trains using that was in the days of the F-40s. Amtrak and the T were both using them, and everything went well. So I'm just sort of the belief that we could probably get a lot done real quick to get started here, especially when there are going to be electrifying routes on the T. Might have a couple of surplus train sets. Do what we're doing with the Valley Flyer. Just start running some trains and see what happens. There's your study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Richard Holzman from Chester, and this has been a very productive meeting and probably one of the best I've attended. But I just want to say, and this may shock everybody, that there is a role for buses. The role for buses will be to serve the train stations that are established in whether it's 4 or 5 or whatever, because the trains can act as a spine for the state.
Right.
And these, I call them shuttle buses, could run within the radius of 20 miles or 40 miles, make sure people get to where they have to go in an efficient manner, and they won't create any sort of log jams or gridlock at the train stations. But so much has been said that's valuable here. I think you have enough to go on, and let's go with something that can be done realistically in the shorter term that will be productive, and who knows what's going to happen 25 or 40 years from now. We may also have higher speed rail. We don't know yet what's going to happen, but we know we have an existing infrastructure that can be utilized with upgrades that's going to make a real difference.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And I see one more gentleman there.
May I thank you? I'm Bob Daly. I'm the third tenor from the 3 tenors of Chester. Thanks for the opportunity. I'd just like to focus on the phasing word that somebody brought up, and offer this think piece, I guess I'd call it. I'd call it the low-hanging fruit hybrid option. While we're figuring out what the best need for speed is between Springfield and Boston, and I can see where that's important. I think it's somewhat less important for a high-speed rail between Pittsfield and Springfield. However, do not lose sight of the fact that in addition to underserved places in Western Mass, there are transportation deserts like Chester, for example, where we have no public transportation. So the low-hanging fruit hybrid option I would see could be, following up on what Dave was saying, let's look at using perhaps the Metro North model, which is so successful, only 40 miles from where we are, and get some trains on the world's best track infrastructure, which is literally within 50 feet of our beautiful historic 1840 station, which could open next week and serve passengers. So thanks for listening. Thanks for all your hard work, and keep it up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think we're getting to the end of our meeting, and what I want to remind you is that Ethan remains very interested in getting additional thoughts you might have after today's meeting. If you were one of the first, John, and you heard things around the table that you wanted to add to your remarks. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me finish up for a second, okay? And then I'll get you. Please consider sending him an email, and it would be great if you did it by next Monday, which is March 2nd, so that it can be included in any other discussions and planning going forward. And then this lady over here.
Hi, Karen Christensen from the Train Campaign and the Western Mass Rail Coalition. See over here. Most of you already have this prospectus or position paper that we put out, but if you have not got a copy, please do so. The website for the coalition is westernmassrail.org, and we will be posting things there, and you can link to all the different organizations that are part of that. Thanks very much. This has been a very, very interesting, productive meeting.
So thank you all for coming. Thanks for your patience, but we're ending right on time, which I always try to do. We don't have the dates yet for the next advisory committee meeting and public meeting, but we will be in touch, and we will definitely try to set up this meeting to have further discussions about today's presentations. Thank you all so much for your ideas. And again, please get back to us again if you have more thoughts on how we should be proceeding.